All right. Okay, we're going to get started. Welcome to Transformation Blueprint, where we unpack our criminal legal system and build pathways to change. I'm Kayla Richards from the Minnesota Justice Research Center. In each episode, we translate research into actionable knowledge. We spotlight local and national change makers and connect you with ways to create a more just Minnesota. Whether you're an advocate, policymaker, or someone who simply cares about justice in your community, this is your blueprint for transformation. Today, I'm so excited to be joined by two incredible guests working to transform our pretrial system. First, we have Anna Hall, a criminal defense attorney at the Legal Rights Center here in Minneapolis, who's also leading the JRC's project to study and redesign Minnesota's pretrial system through direct representation, community education, qualitative research, and partnership building. Anna works to make the law more accessible to all Minnesotans, especially those most impacted by the criminal legal system. Also joining us this morning is Tim Schnacke, a national pretrial expert and executive director of the Center for Legal and Evidence-Based Practices in Colorado. And they work to provide research and consulting for jurisdictions trying to improve their bail practices. He's also a pretrial legal analyst, author of several foundational publications in the field, with years of legal experience from places like DC to Colorado, and has also received the John C. Hendricks Pioneer Award for his contributions to pretrial justice here in America. Well, welcome. I'm grateful to have both of you joining us this morning. I know there's a lot going on in the world, and so I'm curious how you're both doing, and would love to hear maybe something good that's happened recently in your life, personal life or professional life. Give me something good.
I'll go ahead. Thanks for having us, Kayla. Happy to be here and really excited to be in this conversation with Tim, especially whose foundational texts we relied on really heavily when doing our research. Um, I got a house recently, so that's my big news. It's the big activity of my life is, getting it in working order and
Yes.
filling it with furniture that I don't have yet and, weeding the garden. So that's top of mind and really exciting and really privileged to be able to have a house.
Wonderful. Did you buy a lawnmower?
Not yet. My mom
Okay.
keeps telling me I should though.
That's how you know when you've hit the pinnacle of adulting, when you're looking at lawnmower. So congratulations.
Thank you.
That's super exciting and good news for sure. Tim, what about you?
Well, when you're gone beyond adulting, when you get rid of your lawnmower and you zero escape your entire lawn. And that's what we did this last year. So I decided I didn't want to mow lawns anymore. I'd done it my whole life. And so we're just into that kind of Colorado look that we get with the bushes and the rocks and things in between.
Oh, I love it. I love it. So into a different stage of life. We're not mowing anymore.
Right.
Um, we've got a couple of houses like that on our block. And there's like some particular name for them. They're not master gardeners, but they're like master water conservators or something. And it basically just means you sort of allow the natural landscape to grow rather than needing to do a lot extra to it, which is kind of nice and
It
exciting
is nice.
for you, Tim. I'm so curious, now that we have a little context about some of the things happening with both of you right now. How did you end up in pretrial work? Sort of what in your life, professionally and personally, led you here? Anna, do you want to start?
Sure. I went to law school originally, coming out of the Black Lives Matter movement. I had lived here in Minneapolis prior to law school. Jamar Clark was murdered when I was living here, participated in a lot of those protests, and really became interested in and oriented toward a career committed to transforming the way that we deal with harm and racial injustice in our country. So I explored that through a bunch of different ways, ended up landing on pretrial in large part because it felt like a place in the legal system where one decision could shape the
Mm,
course of someone's life for a very long time. And so intervention at that point feels meaningful.
yeah.
And that's why I decided to devote the last several years of my life to thinking about it, talking to people about it, doing community education around it. Because I think if we can shift how we're doing this kind of first moment in a criminal legal case, that has ripple effects that we may not even fully understand yet.
I love that. So impact for you.
Yeah.
Tim, what about you? What led you to this space and place?
Yeah, it's a strange journey, but I got out of law school a long time ago, and I decided I would find fame and fortune out in Washington, D.C. So I was working in one of those things they call a K Street law firm and doing telecommunications law, which is all that really means is you have a lot of rich clients.
Mm,
Uh, and I got sick of that. And so I came back west and slowly started recognizing some of the stuff that was happening in criminal justice. I worked up in the mountains and was part of a police agency up there and some other things. But eventually I took a job in a thing called a criminal justice coordinating committee. And that's
mm,
just like any collaborative group that you would have. Ours was a countywide, you could have a statewide. And they put all the leaders together and stakeholders and affected persons and different people from the community. And they all try to set policy for criminal things. And one day they said, hey, we're not sure that we understand what we're doing when it comes to bail.
mm,
We need to look into it. And they chose me because I had a whole bunch of experience. And so I showed up for my first appearance, very first appearance I ever saw where a bail setting was done, and noticed how incredibly unfair, lopsided, and irrational it was. I mean, the
mm,
numbers made no sense. I found out later they made them up out of whole cloth. From that project, I wrote a paper, and in the past, I'd written papers where I said, well, we do half right and we do half wrong. Let's fix this. This paper basically said we were doing it completely wrong.
mm,
That started us off, those of us that worked on that, toward publishing more papers, doing more studies, and has led us most recently to dive sort of back into more of a fundamentals aspect to do a huge literature search and write another paper to try to tell the country kind of where we are right now after 15, 20 years of what we've been doing.
mm. Wonderful. So it sounds like you had all of this professional experience, and then it was sort of this, you know, moment where you were in court, sounds like in a courtroom where a bail hearing was happening. And it sort of compelled you to take maybe what felt like even a radical stance at the time. You know, you had said it historically, it was sort of you were working to acknowledge the things that were going well and maybe offering some places for improvement. But this was so moving that you wanted to tell the story of all of the ways that we really weren't engaging in a practice that was fair or equitable or just.
And I see this from other people who come from different backgrounds. We had a judge who ran our committee he was used to doing federal civil trials, and he just couldn't believe how messed up the bail system was. But the people in the bail system, the ones neck deep in it and immersed in it, had a hard time seeing the problems. They were the
Mm,
ones that kept telling us, why fix what isn't broken? But so sometimes, and this goes back to the 60s, we had some outsiders push America into a wave of reform because they were outsiders. And when they looked at it, they said, this just seems unfair. And they were right then, and they're right now.
mm. Yeah, so seemingly like maybe folks or forces that aren't necessarily like assimilated into the way that, you know, things have always been done and can sort of
Exactly.
notice some of these things. And um, you know, I know we're here to talk about changing pretrial practices in Minnesota. But Tim, you sort of made this reference to bail. And so for folks who may not be sure what exactly we mean when we say pretrial, you know, we on the call know this refers to everything that happens sort of between arrest or citation and then the resolution of the case. But a lot of people think of bail when they think of pretrial. but that term can actually refer to a whole host of different things depending on where you are. And so, Anna, do you want to talk, just a little bit about what bail means here in Minnesota? And then I'd love to hear from both of you about what you sort of think about in terms of the biggest misconceptions, about bail or about pretrial. But what's bail mean in Minnesota, Anna?
There's a couple of meanings. So I'll start with what we sort of commonly refer to as bail. When somebody says bail on the street, if you walked up to somebody and asked them what it meant, what they'd tell you is it's money. Bail is the amount of money that you have to pay in order to be released during the pretrial period. And that's kind of practically true in Minnesota. When we talk about bail, when a judge sets bail, what they mean is they're setting a certain monetary amount. There's a historical definition, a legal definition of bail that's important to know in Minnesota, for constitutional reasons, which I can get into in a second. But the legal historical understanding of bail was that rather than just being one set cash amount, it is a process of release.
Hmm.
So historically, people would refer to being bailable as being releasable
Hmm.
through a particular process. So our Constitution in Minnesota says, not verbatim, but basically that all people are bailable before trial. There is an exception written into the Constitution for death penalty cases. We don't have the death penalty in Minnesota anymore, and so what that means is that all cases, all criminal cases in Minnesota are bailable. So if somebody is charged with a crime in Minnesota, they can't be just held. They can't be just ordered detained. They have to have either be released on their own recognizance, meaning without any conditions at all, or they need to be released with a cash bail amount set, and sometimes other types of conditions set as well. The language of being bailable that exists in our Constitution is really important because what it tells us is that Minnesota is a state that has a really broad right to release during the pretrial period.
Hmm.
The big if of that is if you can meet your conditions.
Got
And
it.
that's the thing that really catches people up. And what it ends up detaining people often in Minnesota is they can't meet their conditions, including the condition of paying some amount of cash
Hmm.
bail.
Can you say, Anna, what some of those other conditions might be, for example, that folks might have a hard time meeting?
Yeah, so conditions can range broadly. The ones that are used, regularly are things like complete regular drug testing,
Mhm.
a no contact order with the alleged victim in the case. Ones that are often very difficult for people to meet are things like electronic home monitoring, which is, like an ankle bracelet or something like that that monitors someone's location. Those, in some parts of Minnesota, people are required to pay a daily rate for
Mm.
electronic home monitoring, which is very expensive and often can't be afforded by people charged with criminal offenses. Another difficult condition to meet is often attend substance abuse treatment.
Mm.
If there is not space available in a treatment facility, then a person can't be released if that's part of their conditions of release.
Got
So
it.
there's not a huge limitation on judges in terms of what kinds of conditions they can impose on people during the pretrial period. But those are some of the ones that are most commonly used.
Okay, that's so helpful. And it sounds like some of them, could be things that are completely out of a person's control, like when you name, access to a bed in a treatment facility, things like that. Um, I'm curious, what do you think are some of the biggest like misconceptions about, you know, bail or biggest stories that are told about bail or pretrial that simply aren't real?
I'd be curious to hear Tim's take on this actually, since he's been sort of talking to people about this longer. I mean, I have thoughts, but I'm wondering if what comes up for him right away.
Um, First of all, I'd like to, I really commend Ann on coming to her own conclusion, which is that the definition of bail historically and legally is a process of release. If you go back to the Norman invasion, and we created a thing called bail because we had this length of time we had to deal with, that was the process they came up with to actually release people. Why it became a big deal was because back in about 2013, the whole country was using the word differently everywhere you went. Sometimes it was because it was in their law. You know, New York defined bail as money. So you would have people in New York saying, we want to get rid of bail, meaning money. But other people in other states who had a right to bail in their constitution would just be confused.
Right.
So I was asked to write a paper, define bail. It took me kind of a long paper to do it. But we ended up with that notion of bail being a process of release. And when you think of it that way, even though you might have it defined in your own state a different way, the legal and historical way as a process of release helps you not be confused. So for instance, there's a US Supreme Court case that equates the right to bail with the right to freedom before conviction and the right to liberty. That makes absolutely no sense if you think bail is money. So it's helpful to know both. And as what we're seeing over time, I think Anna can attest to this, our people are actually changing the word bail. Once they get fully educated, they just take the word bail out of the laws. It happened in the federal system. It's happened in New Mexico and other states. So it's just a matter of education to figure out what that is. All we're really talking about with the pretrial phase, the most important aspect of it is release and detain. There's all kinds of other things though. And when it comes to misconceptions, it's funny because there are a lot of misconceptions that we learned at the very first of this generation of bail reform, which really threw people for a loop. For instance, we used to think that charge was indicative of someone's risk. In fact, we figured that if whatever charge you were charged with showed how risky you were, and in fact, risky to do the same exact thing. So if you were charged with kidnapping, we would assume, well, that's really high risk to go out and kidnap someone else if we release you. All this research came in and started to show that charge was a really bad proxy for risk. So that was a misconception that people had going into it, was just notions of risk and prediction. And we still have those misconceptions today. We don't understand why we even need to predict. And yet the reason that we have to predict someone's future success or failure in a pretrial phase of the case is because we are American, and it's because we value liberty and freedom. Therefore, we have this expectation of freedom, and therefore you have to try to make predictions. But there's three recently I've written about too, in addition to risk and prediction, that are big misconceptions. One is just this notion of why we are at the same time across America, every single state, working on pretty much the same thing. Why is this a national sort of bail reform movement versus just odds and ends, things like that? And to study the history of bail, what you learn are there certain themes and markers of bail reform that perfectly line up and led us into this bail reform movement. And then what we realize is this bail reform movement is all about fixing secured money's ability to keep people in jail is the biggest problem. The other one, I told you about risk and prediction, but another one is just the words themselves. What bail means, we already talked about that. What is a pretrial improvement? Well, that's a different meaning. What is pretrial justice? That's kind of like an umbrella term that we use to just cover everything out of the box. Everything from, you want to talk about housing, you want to talk about mental health, you want to talk about restorative justice. The pretrial justice umbrella allows you to talk about literally everything that will help people when they're in the system. And then finally, the biggest misconception lately has been how to do intentional release and detention. What are the actual elements of it? How do you put it together? How do you make it last?
Wonderful. Thank you. Anna, I'm curious, like what's coming up for you as you're sort of listening to Tim talk about some of the misconceptions?
I totally agree with everything he said. one big misconception that popped up for me right away was the idea that um, paying bail keeps keeps the community safer, right? We use the term skin in the game a lot. When somebody has to pay bail, they have skin in the game to show up for court, to not commit any offenses during the pretrial period. And instinctually, I think that makes sense to a lot of people, in part because it's how we've talked about it for a very long time. But it also seems like, yeah, if you have something on the line, like, sure, that's going to motivate you, right? Um, it turns out that's not how human brains work. And so there's really no research to support that
Mm,
paying bail makes somebody more likely to come back to court or makes them less likely to be arrested during the pretrial period.
mm,
Um, Lots of studies have looked at it, tried to isolate, all the variables, and found really either no impact at all of paying bail, or sometimes a negative impact, making them less likely to come to court.
mm.
And we see that that's true in practice when we look at places that have stopped using cash bail entirely. So our team went to New Jersey. We observed court. We talked with a lot of people who work within the system. We've looked at their data. In 2017, they stopped using cash bail, and they've had no change in appearance rates since then. Or some years, actually, appearance rates are better than they were when they were using cash bail. And the rates of people being rearrested during the pretrial period are actually lower or the same. So we're seeing that play out in real time. And there are other jurisdictions that we could talk about, I'm sure. Tim has the DC is a good example of things like that. But that's one really, really common misconception that's really at the root of I think of people's attachment to cash bail.
Yeah.
That, like, even given all of the negative impacts that using money in the legal system might have, we think it works, and so we hold on to it. And in fact, it doesn't work. And not only does it not work, but other things work way better.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Yeah,
similar to,
it's
oh, sorry,
interesting to
Tim.
think. Um, I really want to echo that because that is, you think about big misconceptions like I talked about, and more of these sort of just amazingly core misconceptions like for 200 years, we have thought that money motivates people to come back to court and stay out of trouble. That's just the essence of the bail system. And now the
Mhm.
research shows that no, money doesn't motivate people to do either of those things. Um, the idea that um, somehow detaining someone is going to make your community safe. The research is showing that if you detain the wrong persons, you'll actually make your community less safe.
Mm.
A giant misconception as well about just risk of people charged with crimes. It turns out when you really dive into the risk research and the research that goes into sort of figuring out what people do when they fail on pretrial release, you find out that people accused with crimes are simply not very risky at all.
Mm.
They're certainly not risky to do the really bad things that we normally consider need to be detained for, like flight and committing a violent crime. And you find out the toughest one of all, which is that flight and committing a violent or serious crime is almost impossible to predict. And that changes everything.
Yeah, sort of echoed when Anna was talking about bail or cash bail not really being equitable or even relatable to levels of risk, and what you were talking about earlier in terms of level of charge, being predictive of risk. So again, it sounds like there are these stories that sort of, irregardless of research, continue to sort of permeate, and exist in communities. And Anna, when you said, the result then is folks continue to hang on to these ideas, that just aren't based in research. And so I'm curious, Anna, what you might say the goals of pretrial practices are. Whether it's bail or detention or conditions of release. What are like the big takeaway goals?
There are two goals that the legal system has historically recognized for pretrial, which we've named kind of a couple of times in a couple different ways. One is making sure people come back to court for their court hearings, and the other is to ensure community safety. And you can think about that in a bunch of different ways. Maybe that means making sure that somebody doesn't get rearrested. Maybe, maybe it means making sure they don't get charged again, however you want to talk about that. But community safety and court appearance are the two big ones that we often talk about in the pretrial space. And so that's why, Tim and I keep saying, well, what we're doing doesn't actually ensure either of those things, because those are the things that we're really working toward. And those are the things that the courts have said are legitimate considerations, legitimate goals of pretrial conditions. And so if we're setting conditions that aren't achieving either of those things, then I think a real serious question arises about whether what we're doing is legal or constitutional, given that those are supposed to be our goals.
Right, right. Yeah, if what we're doing isn't working and isn't aligned with the goals that we say are part of pretrial practices, I'm curious, Tim, are there current practices in our country that are effective at achieving those goals?
Well, we know that we can release a heck of a lot of people with absolutely no conditions and do really well. The one, and then when you get into the research as to what works, that's where things get a little interesting, because states can set up these conditions. As Anna said, you set your conditions to either try to help achieve court appearance or public safety. And when you're setting them up as release conditions, all you really have to do as a state is to provide some sort of a rational reason for them. And in the past, for instance, money, the rational reason was, well, it motivates people for everything else. Why shouldn't it motivate them to do this? They also say same things about EM and those kind of things. The research, though, as it has been done, tends to show and is showing now that most all of the traditional conditions that we impose are mixed research, with some even going so far as to saying, yeah, I would never use this again as any kind of best practice. We were in Illinois the other day. Illinois is a classic case of a state that studied the research front to back. And when at the end of their study, they said, we're just going to get rid of money altogether. It doesn't work. It doesn't motivate anyone. And then we talked to a judge just 2 days ago or 3 days ago who was showing us around the courthouse during a detention hearing. And somebody asked her if she did drug testing. And she goes, oh, absolutely not. That's not a best practice. And what she was saying was the research does not support it. What we're seeing is a big trend, which I think is a very good trend, which is we are moving from this traditional notion of supervision and control in pretrial services to one of supports and simply helping people succeed. And that's a whole different animal than what we're used to. But I even see the field itself, the people that I know that run pretrial services agencies wanting to do that and aiming to do that. So I figure that's going to happen over time.
Wonderful.
Oh, by the way, the one thing that works, evidence-based practice, if you want to know one thing that you can do that works every single time you do it and everywhere you do it, it's court date notifications. That's our one big evidence-based practice that we do.
Yeah. And when you say court date notifications, we're talking like modern day technology notifications.
Yeah, well, I did one of the very first studies a long time ago in 2006, and we did a live caller. We had a live caller calling people on the phone, and I wrote a big long paper about how, hey, there's a lot of benefits to doing that live caller thing if you don't want to, hire a company to do the thing for you. And I tried to make the case for it, but the other day I heard a lot of people talking about, well, we think text messages are the absolute best way to do it. If you were thinking about doing it, and I honestly would tell every single state in America, do this. In fact, do it statewide. Do it often, remind them 3 different times. Do exactly what the research says. Use the language that they say to use. And if you do it, I can guarantee you your court appearance rates will start to go way, way up.
That's so helpful.
And Kayla, just so that you guys know, that we do have a statewide court reminder system in Minnesota. It's not best practices for a couple of reasons. One is it requires people to opt into the system to choose to get reminders, which, first of all, if somebody's not arrested, if they're just cited and then released right away, they're not going to be asked, do you want to be added to this system? So especially for their first court date, they may not have a reminder coming in because they haven't opted in. And then if they check in and somebody forgets to ask them if they want to opt in, or they forget to check in at their next court date, there's a lot of ways that people can get missed. And so what we know from the state courts who have looked at this and implemented the system is that only about 25 to 26% of cases in
Wow.
Minnesota are receiving court reminders, which means that there's this like a massive, massive number of people in Minnesota who aren't being reminded of their court dates. And I mean, I get a reminder for like the dentist, I get a reminder for the doctor, I get a reminder for, the things I don't want reminders for. And so it seems like we should be able to make a couple of easy fixes in Minnesota, including having people automatically enrolled. And if they want to opt out, they can. But I think that's probably unlikely. And then the other thing I will say is that studies show it's really, really inexpensive. I mean,
Mm.
compared to the expense of having someone miss a court date and have to put out a warrant and reschedule the court date and all this stuff, the expense of automated court reminders that are text messages or emails is infinitesimal. And there's really no reason that we shouldn't be doing it better here.
Mm.
Anna, I want to give you two numbers that'll blow your mind because somebody did Pew gave a whole presentation on court date reminders last week. And they looked at Colorado, and we had an opt-in system, meaning the person had to actually do something to get into the system to be reminded. And we had a 1% rate of people that opted in. And we
Wow.
changed state law to make it opt out. And now we're reaching 98% of the people.
Wow. And
Yeah.
listen, I hope there's some Minnesota court staff listening to this right now because that's how you do it.
Now, and there's another thing too. Court appearance, I mean, you think about it, court appearance is the only reason why we have money to begin with, money bail. It's just historically what we use it for. We don't use it for public safety. We got other things that are more complicated than that. But we also did a study that said not only does court date notification in advance work to raise your court appearance rates, but also there's a whole bunch of other things that can happen after the actual FTA that you can stay a warrant. You can you can call them and tell them about a warrant and they'll come in. We had a chambers in one courthouse in Colorado. We took both of our studies, which is pre-court notification, and then post-FTA notification. They put them together, and they ended up with a 99% court appearance rate.
Wow. Wow. And Tim, that FTA, that's failure to appear. So folks who are not showing up.
Yeah, right. And when you get to a point where it's 99% court appearance, meaning an only 1% FTA rate, that throws the entire money bail system into disarray.
Yep.
Because you start to realize, wow, I'm not sure anybody really flees anymore anyway.
Mm.
Yeah, I think that brings up a really good point, Tim, that we haven't hit on yet, which is when we're talking about the concerns around court appearance and rearrest during the pretrial period, there's all sorts of levels of seriousness of that you could be considering. So right now, the way we think about pretrial goals is we want everyone to come to every court appearance all the time. And controlling for that risk is easy, right? As we've just talked about, you can do court reminders. And is that really the risk we're worried about? Tim is talking about flight, meaning somebody is intentionally not coming to court, maybe leaving the jurisdiction in order to not face the justice system, go through the criminal legal process, whatever it is.
Sure.
That's really uncommon.
Mm.
It was always pretty uncommon, but especially now, it's spectacularly difficult to just disappear. I
This is
mean,
so
we're online, we are easily trackable. My investigator has the resources to find people without all that much work, right? So people aren't fleeing. And the other thing about, other than technology, is that in Minnesota, somewhere around 80% of criminal defendants are represented by the public defender, meaning they cannot afford an attorney.
Yep.
They are low enough income that the state has to provide one for them. Those are not people who have the resources to relocate
Right.
even to a new apartment in the same city, much less flee the jurisdiction. So when we're talking about flight, I think we really need to start narrowing, like, what is our actual concern here? Is our concern like the expense of people not coming to court? Well, we have a way to deal with that, and it's not money bail, it's court reminders.
Hmm.
And if it's and or is our concern that people are fleeing? And then we have to look at the reality of that. Are people
Right.
really fleeing? And if and when they do, are there other ways to address it? I mean, if they're gonna flee, they're gonna flee whether they've paid cash bail or not, right? That's not the thing that's gonna keep them around. So it starts to fall apart, that particular rationale for cash bail in
Gosh,
particular.
Val. That's so helpful. And so again, in terms of just stories that exist, there's this big story about like intentional avoidance. And what I'm hearing you say is the reality is like that's not the reality. And when you name things like court reminders and then the evidence that we have of the way that court appearances then improve after we have implemented, some standardized way of reminding folks of their court dates, it suggests then that it's sort of accidental or unintentional when people aren't showing up, right? Or that there are sort of big obstacles coming up for folks.
Right.
Um, I'm so curious to hear about, the JRC's pretrial research project. But before we go there, and maybe this is a silly question, but why is it then that we're clinging on to cash bail? If we know all of this stuff, or we say we know what we know, but in practice, we aren't acting like that's what we know. What's that about?
I'll jump in. It's because I've thought about it for now nearly 20 years. Part of it is just custom and habit. You go to a place, they just don't know any different. I've been
Mm,
places where judges have no idea maybe what their bail statute even says. They were never trained in law school on it. They were never really trained on the bench on it. They were just given a piece of paper that has a number next to the charge, and they set the number, and that's it. Um, we also have an industry that
mm,
makes billions of dollars, and they go all over the country and have a bit of an army that fights any kind of reduction in using money at bail. And they always are trying to add money to constitutions, when it comes to bail. And probably the third big thing in my opinion is that everybody has been really confused about, well, what's the alternative? Because to me, I've always felt like money doesn't work. I know that. I learned that early on. But if you don't, but we use money to detain people. We have a weird legal system that allows it to happen. It's a weird sort of a loophole. So money is good at keeping people in jail, and judges have taken advantage of that loophole for about 200 years.
mm,
So to get rid of money means, well, now how do I detain people? And they don't know the answer to that. And as a field, we didn't know the answer to that until 2017. And now we're starting to get that answer to move across the country, with Illinois being the very first state to actually put in place a really decent intentional release detain system, which is the alternative to using money.
mm. Anna, what would you add? Because I'm hearing Tim sort of name that there are folks who benefit, from the way that things are currently are, and that there are people in spaces where this knowledge of alternatives that actually work just isn't as present as maybe others.
Yeah, I think I first would just echo that change is hard for all people. And the older you are and the longer you've been doing a particular thing a particular way, as a individual and then as a society also, the harder it is to shift away from that. So I think there's just some basic kind of human psychology around this attachment to the way things have been done.
Mm.
Um, I also think there's something uniquely American about the belief that money is the great motivator. Um, the United States is one of only two countries in the world that has a for-profit bail system.
Mm.
Um, so, that in and of itself sets us apart, maybe not in a positive way. And we do have this kind of cultural understanding of money as being a
The goal.
the goal, the thing that pushes us all away from the things we don't want and toward the things we do want, right? And that's often we see a million examples of how that's not true, and still we sort of hold tight to that way of thinking. And so I think bail is a really good example of that. We hold tight to this belief that if money is on the line, surely a person will do X, Y, Z, and we don't see that being the case.
Mm.
Um, in terms of the industry that Tim is talking about, and he's talking about the bail bond industry, which a lot of folks I think are familiar with bail bond companies. When a bail gets set and somebody doesn't have the money to post that monetary bail, that cash bail on their own, they can go to a bail bondsman, pay a percentage of their bail amount to that bail bondsman. So, if my bail is set at $10,000, I can go to a bail bondsman, pay him $1,000. I don't get that money back. That's a fee to this for-profit organization company, and in return, they post bond with the court. That doesn't mean that they pay money to the court. What they do basically is file a piece of paper with the court that says, we, the bail bond company, promise to make sure that this person comes back to court. And if they don't come back to court, we will pay the full bail amount to the court. That industry is extremely lucrative for the people who are in it. Because they don't have to refund any money ever, right, to the people who pay for their services, and because they don't have to actually outlay any money on the front end.
Mm.
So if somebody doesn't show up for court, and if the court decides that they want the bail money to get paid by the bail bond company, both of which are big ifs, then the bail bond company still will likely fight the court on whether they have to actually pay that bail money. They'll bring in lawyers, they'll argue it, and often they end up not having to pay it or only having to pay a portion of it.
Wow.
So they're not losing a ton of money. They're being backed by insurance companies who are making sure that all the money they're promising to the court is available, but those insurance companies are also making a ton of money off of this. It's one of their most lucrative investments. Insurance company executives have said they're 0 to 1% losses for them on insuring bail bonds. So there's this entire network of for-profit companies that are making money off of our poorest people who
Right.
can't afford their bail, which is why they're going to bail bond companies.
Wow.
And it brings me back to one final misconception, which is that bail bond companies do a lot of work to make sure that we're meeting our pretrial goals. One of the co-authors of our report, Dr. Josh Page from the University of Minnesota, worked as a bail bond agent for a period of time and has written articles about it and talked in the media about it. And what his research shows and what other research shows is that when somebody doesn't show up for court, it's often not the bail bond company that goes and finds them and brings them back to court. It's usually law enforcement.
Mm.
Right. So now we're paying law enforcement to do the thing that's the bail bonds person is supposed to be doing.
Interesting.
They do some work, they do some court reminder phone calls. Could we do that through the courts? Yeah, probably. Right. We've talked about that already. But often they're not doing very much work on the front end. They're definitely not monitoring the location of the person that they've helped get out. They're certainly not preventing them in some way from potentially reoffending or doing some other sort of harmful thing in the community. They're really just there to protect that little, nest egg of money that they've promised to the court, but they don't really ever want to pay to the court, nor do they intend to pay to the court. So it's like they're making money and they're not really doing a whole lot. And that again is this misconception that like, oh, bail bond companies are really important because those agents are the ones making sure these people come back to court and behave pre-trial, and that we're just not seeing that that's true.
Interesting.
And one thing, Anna, that you may have left out when you say, "Oh yeah, if the person doesn't come back, we will pay." Well, in reality, the bail bond company, the bail agent on the street, has more than likely not agreed to help that person get out of jail unless his family has put up the collateral such that he'll never have to pay himself the full amount of the $10,000. So that's one layer of, they don't even have to go fight the court. If the person doesn't show up, they just collect on mom's sofa or dad's car. And they'll tell you up front online, we rely on people's families. It's not the defendant that we represent, it's their families, which is why you end up with a whole lot of people in jail who are called bailable, meaning they're released, have an order of release with an amount of money. And you would think, well, if the bail industry was like any insurance industry, they would release everybody and take some losses, but they take no losses. In fact, they brag about the fact that they take no losses.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of Transformation Blueprint and for joining us for the first half of this powerful conversation. Keep an eye out for part 2, which will follow in a couple of weeks, where Anna, Tim, and I dive into the Justice Research Center's recent study of Minnesota's bail, jail, and pretrial practices, what it means in the national context of this work, and ways all of us can get involved. Here at the JRC, we really believe in the power of possibility and transformation. This work translates our efforts, it aligns transformation initiatives, and provides education on complex legal issues, all to share the story of our collective work and how we can all contribute to it. Join me next time as we continue building the blueprint for a more just Minnesota. Until then, stay engaged, stay curious, and remember that transformation starts with you.